couldn't sleep the night before. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that envelope sitting on Margaret's desk at her law office downtown. The DNA results. 3 weeks of waiting. And now they were just sitting there, waiting for tomorrow's hearing. I kept telling myself I already knew what they'd say. Tommy was mine and David's. There was never any question in my mind. But David's family had planted seeds of doubt everywhere they could, whispering their poison to anyone who'd listen. His mother had even called my sister last month, asking pointed questions about my behavior during the marriage. The whole thing made me sick. The apartment felt too quiet without Tommy. My mom had picked him up that afternoon, said she'd keep him overnight so I could focus on getting ready. He'd looked so small in his blue jacket, clutching that stuffed elephant he carried everywhere. When I kissed his forehead goodbye, he smelled like apple juice and that baby shampoo I always used. 3 years old and already caught in the middle of this mess. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, staring at the papers Margaret had given me to review. Bank statements, medical records from Dr. Peterson's office, text messages I'd printed out months ago when things first got ugly. Everything was there in black and white, but I still felt like I was walking into a trap. David's father had money. Real money. The kind that came with connections and lawyers who wore expensive suits and spoke in ways that made you feel small. His whole family had this way of looking at you like you were something they'd found on the bottom of their shoe. They'd never liked me. Not from the beginning. I was from the wrong side of Millbrook, went to public school instead of St. Catherine's, worked at the diner instead of having some fancy career. When David and I first started dating, his mother would make these little comments. "Oh, how nice that you work," she'd say, like serving coffee and eggs was some kind of hobby. His father barely acknowledged I existed until I got pregnant. Then suddenly I was the topic of every family dinner, every hushed phone conversation. The divorce had been brutal enough. 18 months of fighting over everything from the couch to the car payments. But when David started questioning whether Tommy was his son, something inside me just broke. Not because I doubted the truth, but because I realized how far he was willing to go to hurt me. This wasn't about custody or child support anymore. This was about erasing us completely. Margaret had warned me it would get worse before it got better. She'd handled cases like this before, she said. Men who couldn't handle losing control, families who thought they could buy their way out of responsibility. But she'd also said we had a strong case. The timeline was clear, the medical records were solid, and David's own words would speak for themselves. I picked up my phone and scrolled through the photos of Tommy. His first steps, his second birthday party, the day he'd gotten into my makeup and painted his face like some kind of warrior. In every single picture, he looked exactly like David had at that age. Same dark hair, same stubborn chin, same way of tilting his head when he was thinking. Anyone with eyes could see it. But tomorrow wasn't about what anyone could see. Tomorrow was about proving what everyone already knew, in a room full of people who'd already made up their minds. I finished my cold coffee and tried to imagine walking into that courthouse, sitting across from David and his family, watching them try to convince a judge that my son was a stranger. The clock on the microwave said 2:17 a.m. In 7 hours, I'd be getting dressed for the most important day of my life. Not my wedding day, not the day Tommy was born, but the day I'd have to fight for the right to call him David's son. The day I'd have to prove what should never have needed proving in the first place. The courthouse smelled like old wood and disinfectant. Margaret had gotten there early to set up our files, and when I walked in, she gave me one of those reassuring nods that lawyers probably practice in the mirror. David was already seated at the other table with his attorney, some sharp-faced woman in a navy suit who'd probably cost more than I made in 6 months. But it was David's father who made my stomach drop. Richard Hartwell sat in the front row like he owned the place, which he probably thought he did. The man had that same cold stare he'd given me at every family gathering, every holiday dinner where I'd felt like an unwelcome guest. Next to him sat David's mother, Patricia, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval that I knew so well. Judge Morrison called the session to order, and everything felt surreal. This sterile room with its fluorescent lights and worn carpet was where my son's future would be decided, where strangers would determine whether Tommy had the right to carry his father's name, to be acknowledged as part of the Hartwell family tree. Margaret had warned me that their opening would be aggressive, but I wasn't prepared for the venom in Richard's voice when he stood up. The man had been a successful businessman for 40 years, used to getting his way through intimidation and checkbooks. His voice carried across the courtroom like he was addressing a board meeting. "Your Honor, my family has been subjected to months of harassment and false accusations," he began, his words sharp and calculated. "We're here today because someone wants to force a connection that simply doesn't exist. This woman wants to tie an innocent child to our family based on nothing but convenience and financial opportunity." I felt Margaret's hand touch my arm, a silent reminder to stay calm. But Richard wasn't done. He turned slightly, just enough that his cold gray eyes found mine across the room. "We have serious doubts about the timing of this child's conception, Your Honor. My son was traveling extensively for work during the relevant period. There are gaps, inconsistencies, questions that need answering. This child may be many things, but he is not a Hartwell." The words hit me like a physical blow. Not a Hartwell. Like Tommy was some kind of imposter, some random kid I'd plucked off the street and decided to claim. I thought about the way Richard had held Tommy at Christmas 2 years ago, how he'd smiled when Tommy had called him Grandpa Rich, how he'd bought him that expensive toy truck that Tommy still played with every day. David's lawyer stood up next, her voice crisp and professional. She talked about burden of proof and reasonable doubt, about the need for absolute certainty in matters of paternity. She made it sound like I was some kind of criminal trying to pull off an elaborate con. But then David himself stood up, and that's when everything went wrong. "There's no way he's mine," he said, his voice cutting through the formal atmosphere like a knife. "I know what I know, and that kid isn't mine. I won't be responsible for someone else's mistake. Someone else's mistake. Like Tommy was a broken dish or a bounced check. Like 3 years of birthdays and bedtime stories and scraped knees meant nothing. I watched the man I'd once loved, the man I'd thought would be Tommy's hero, stand up in front of a judge and deny his own son's existence." Judge Morrison's voice was sharp. "Mr. Hartwell, please take your seat. This court will determine paternity based on evidence, not outbursts." But the damage was done. David's words hung in the air like smoke, poisoning everything around them. I could feel eyes on me from across the room measuring my reaction, waiting to see if I'd break down or fight back. Margaret leaned over and whispered, "Stay strong. This is exactly what we expected. They're showing their true colors, and the judge sees it." I nodded, but inside I was falling apart. This wasn't just about legal recognition anymore. This was about watching my son's father publicly reject him, about seeing 3 years of family memories get erased in a few cruel sentences. David wasn't just denying paternity. He was denying that Tommy had ever mattered to him at all. The judge called for a brief recess, and as people shuffled around the courtroom, I sat frozen in my chair. Margaret was gathering papers, making notes, preparing for our response. But all I could think about was Tommy at preschool, probably playing with blocks or finger painting, completely unaware that his father was trying to pretend he didn't exist. When court resumed, I felt like I was watching everything happen from underwater. Sounds were muffled, movement seemed slow, and David's words kept echoing in my head like some kind of curse. "That kid isn't mine. Someone else's mistake." Their lawyer had regrouped during the recess. She came back with charts and timelines, trying to create doubt where none should exist. She talked about David's work travel schedule, pointing to a business trip he'd taken to Chicago in March, suggesting the timing didn't add up. She made it sound scientific, mathematical, like conception was something you could calculate down to the minute. "My client was out of state for 2 weeks during the critical period," she said, clicking through slides on her laptop. "Hotel receipts, flight records, meeting schedules, all documented. The timeline presented by the plaintiff simply doesn't align with the physical evidence." But I remembered that Chicago trip. David had called me every night complaining about the hotel, the food, the long meetings. He'd come home a day early because he missed me, showed up at the apartment with flowers and that stupid grin he got when he was trying to make up for being gone. We'd spent the whole weekend together, barely leaving the bedroom. The lawyer kept talking, building her case like she was constructing a wall brick by brick. She mentioned my job at the diner, the late shifts, the tips from customers. She didn't say it directly, but the implication was clear. I worked around men. I was friendly with customers, maybe too friendly. She was painting a picture of someone who might have opportunities, someone whose word couldn't be trusted. I wanted to stand up and scream. I wanted to tell Judge Morrison about the morning sickness that started exactly 6 weeks after that weekend David came home early. About how I'd taken 3 pregnancy tests because I couldn't believe it myself. About how David had cried when I told him. Happy tears, scared tears, but tears of someone who knew this baby was his. Margaret sat perfectly still beside me, letting them dig their own grave. She'd told me this would happen, that they'd overreach, try too hard to create doubt. Let them show who they really are, she'd said. Then we'll show who you really are. David's mother was crying softly in the front row, but I couldn't tell if it was from shame or frustration. Maybe she actually believed their story. Maybe she'd convinced herself that Tommy was some kind of stranger, that the last 3 years had been an elaborate deception. Or maybe she just couldn't face the truth about what her son was doing. The worst part was watching David himself. He sat stone-faced at his table, staring straight ahead like this was happening to someone else. This was the man who used to get up in the middle of the night when Tommy was teething, who'd taught him to say Dada before Mama, who'd insisted on taking 1,000 pictures at every birthday and holiday. Their lawyer finished her presentation with a flourish, suggesting that the court should require additional testing, more evidence, higher standards of proof. She made it sound reasonable, responsible even, but I could see what she was really doing. Buying time, creating obstacles, hoping I'd give up and go away. When Margaret finally stood to respond, the whole room seemed to shift. She didn't rush to her feet or raise her voice. She just stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle, letting their words hang in the air like bad perfume. Your Honor, she began, her voice calm and clear. We've heard a lot of speculation today, theories about travel schedules and mathematical impossibilities. But this case isn't about theories. It's about facts. And the facts are very simple. She walked to our table and picked up a manila folder, thick with documents. The plaintiff has provided comprehensive medical records showing consistent prenatal care from Dr. Peterson's office. Blood work, ultrasounds, delivery records, all indicating a full-term pregnancy with dates that correspond exactly to the timeline in question. Margaret spread the papers across her table like she was laying out a winning hand of cards. We have hospital records from St. Mary's showing the defendant listed as the father on the birth certificate. We have pediatric records showing both parents present for well-child visits. We have photographs, witness statements, and 3 years of consistent paternal behavior. She paused, looking directly at David's lawyer. But perhaps most importantly, we have the defendant's own words, in his own handwriting, acknowledging paternity. Words written not under oath or legal pressure, but in private moments of honesty. I held my breath. This was the moment Margaret had been building toward, the evidence she'd kept hidden until now. David's face had gone pale, and his lawyer was shuffling through her papers, like she'd lost something important. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce into evidence a series of text messages sent by the defendant to my client during her pregnancy. Messages that leave no doubt about his acknowledgement of paternity, his excitement about becoming a father, and his commitment to their growing family. The courtroom was completely silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing. Margaret held up her phone and I could see David's lawyer frantically whispering to her client. But it was too late. The truth was about to come out, in David's own words, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Margaret pulled out her phone and connected it to the courtroom's display system. The screen flickered to life, showing a text message thread between David and me from 18 months ago. My heart started pounding as I recognized the familiar blue and gray bubbles of our old conversations. This message was sent on March 15th at 4:17 a.m., Margaret announced, her voice steady and professional. From the defendant to my client approximately 6 weeks into her pregnancy. The text appeared on the screen, blown up large enough for everyone to read. David's words in his own phone, sent from his own number. Can't sleep thinking about our baby. I'm scared as hell but also excited. Want to be better than my dad was. Want to be there for everything. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. I remembered that night so clearly it hurt. David had been tossing and turning beside me, stressed about work, about money, about becoming a father. I'd woken up to find him sitting on the edge of the bed with his phone, typing in the dark. When I asked what he was doing, he'd just kissed my forehead and said he was sharing his thoughts. Margaret scrolled to the next message, Sent 20 minutes later. Felt the baby move today during the ultrasound. Actually move. Our kid is real, Sarah. This is really happening. I had to close my eyes. That was the day we'd gone to Dr. Peterson's office for the 12-week appointment. David had insisted on coming, had rearranged his entire schedule to be there. When the technician pointed out the baby's tiny form on the grainy screen, David had squeezed my hand so tight it almost hurt. He'd been quiet the whole drive home, overwhelmed by the reality of it all. Your Honor, Margaret continued, these messages continue throughout the pregnancy. The defendant discussing baby names, nursery preparations, his hopes and fears about fatherhood, 37 separate messages over 5 months, all acknowledging paternity, all expressing parental sentiment. David's lawyer was on her feet. Objection, Your Honor. These messages are taken out of context. They represent emotional responses during a difficult time, not legal admissions. Judge Morrison looked skeptical. The court will allow the evidence. Please continue, counselor. Margaret displayed another message, this one from late May. Picked up the crib today. Put it together in what's going to be the baby's room. Can't believe I'm going to be somebody's dad. I glanced across the room at David. His face was white as paper, his hands clenched in his lap. His father was whispering urgently in his ear, but David just sat there staring at the screen like he was seeing a ghost. The next message made my throat tight. Sarah's having contractions. We're heading to the hospital. This is it. Our son is coming. That was September 3rd, 2:30 in the morning. I'd woken up in a puddle of water, contractions 5 minutes apart. David had been calm, collected, grabbing the hospital bag we'd packed weeks earlier. He'd held my hand through 12 hours of labor, cut Tommy's umbilical cord himself, cried when the doctor placed our son on my chest for the first time. Margaret showed one final message, sent 2 days after Tommy was born. Can't stop staring at him. He has your nose but my stubborn chin. Thomas David Hartwell. Our perfect little boy. Thomas David Hartwell. Named after David's grandfather, the one family member who'd always been kind to me. David had insisted on the name. Said he wanted his son to carry on the family tradition. He'd been so proud when he filled out the birth certificate, writing his own name in the father's section with a shaky hand. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the bailiff had stopped moving. Judge Morrison was studying the messages intently, occasionally glancing at David with an expression I couldn't quite read. Margaret turned off the display and faced the judge. Your Honor, these aren't just random text messages. They represent 9 months of acknowledged paternity, documented parental bonding, and legal recognition. The defendant didn't just accept responsibility for this child. He embraced it. He chose the name, signed the birth certificate, and spent 3 years acting as this child's father. She paused, letting the weight of the evidence settle over the room. The defendant's current denial isn't based on new evidence or genuine doubt. It's based on anger, resentment, and a desire to punish my client for ending their marriage. He's trying to erase his own son to get back at his ex-wife. David's lawyer stood up, but she looked defeated before she even started talking. Your Honor, emotions run high during pregnancy and divorce proceedings. These messages reflect a moment in time, not a legal commitment. But Judge Morrison was already shaking her head. Counselor, I've seen many paternity cases in my years on the bench. What I see here is clear, consistent acknowledgement of parentage over an extended period. These aren't ambiguous statements or emotional outbursts. They're specific, detailed, and repeated affirmations of paternal relationship. I felt tears starting to well up in my eyes, but for the first time all day, they weren't tears of fear or frustration. They were tears of relief. The truth was finally coming out in David's own words, and no amount of expensive lawyers or family money could make it disappear. The atmosphere in the courtroom had completely shifted. What started as David's family's confident attack had crumbled into desperate damage control. I watched Richard Hartwell lean forward in his seat, his face red with anger or embarrassment, maybe both. He was whispering harshly to David's lawyer, his gestures sharp and agitated. David himself looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. The color had drained from his face completely, and his hands were shaking slightly as he stared down at the table. These weren't just any text messages Margaret had shown. These were his private thoughts, his genuine emotions, captured in moments when he thought no one was watching or judging. His lawyer was scrambling now, shuffling through papers like she might find some magical piece of evidence that could undo what everyone had just witnessed. But what could possibly counter David's own words? How do you argue against someone's documented feelings about their unborn child? Your Honor, she began, her voice lacking the confidence she'd had earlier. While these messages show emotional attachment, they don't necessarily prove biological paternity. My client may have believed he was the father at the time without actually being the biological parent. It was a weak argument and everyone knew it. Judge Morrison's expression showed exactly what she thought of that reasoning. Counselor, are you suggesting your client was somehow deceived about the timing of conception despite being present throughout the relationship? The lawyer paused, clearly realizing she'd backed herself into a corner. We're simply saying that emotional investment doesn't equal biological fact, Your Honor. Margaret stood up smoothly. Your Honor, we're prepared to present the DNA test results if the court requires additional proof. However, I believe the defendant's own documented acknowledgement of paternity, combined with his 3 years of acting as this child's father, speaks louder than any laboratory report. That's when Patricia Hartwell broke down completely. David's mother had been holding herself together through sheer force of will, but watching her son's words displayed for everyone to see had shattered whatever composure she had left. Her sobs echoed through the quiet courtroom, and I almost felt sorry for her. She'd been there when Tommy was born, had held him in the hospital nursery while I slept. She'd knitted him baby blankets, sent birthday cards, taken hundreds of photographs at family gatherings. Now she was watching her family try to erase all of that, pretend it had never happened. Richard put his arm around his wife, but his face was stone. Even confronted with his son's own words, his own grandson's documented existence, the man refused to show any emotion beyond anger. He whispered something to Patricia that made her crying quiet down, but I could see her shoulders still shaking. David's lawyer tried one more desperate approach. Your Honor, perhaps we could discuss a private settlement. This situation has been difficult for all parties involved, and maybe we can reach an agreement that serves everyone's interests. The suggestion hit me like a slap. After everything they'd put me through, after publicly denying Tommy's existence, now they wanted to make some quiet deal behind closed doors, pay me off and hope the whole thing would disappear. Margaret didn't even look at me before responding. My client isn't interested in a settlement, Your Honor. This isn't about money or private agreements. This is about legal recognition of a child's parentage and his right to be acknowledged by his biological father. I wanted to stand up and applaud. Margaret understood exactly what this was about. Tommy didn't need their money, but he deserved to have his identity confirmed. He deserved to grow up knowing that a court of law had recognized him as David's son, regardless of what his father chose to do with that information. Judge Morrison looked directly at David. Mr. Hartwell, you've remained quiet during most of these proceedings. Do you have anything to say regarding these text messages? Do you dispute sending them? David finally looked up, his eyes red and glassy. For a moment, I thought he might tell the truth, might admit what everyone already knew. But then his father's hand landed on his shoulder, and whatever spark of honesty might have existed died out. I was going through a difficult time, he said quietly. I said things I didn't mean. I was trying to be supportive, but that doesn't change the facts. And what facts are those, Mr. Hartwell? The judge asked. David's voice was barely audible. I don't believe that child is mine. Even as he said it, I could tell he didn't believe his own words. This wasn't conviction. This was cowardice. David was choosing his family's approval over his son's welfare, their money over Tommy's identity. He was throwing away 3 years of fatherhood because it was easier than standing up to his parents. The judge made some notes, her pen scratching loudly in the silence. When she looked up, her expression was carefully neutral, but I thought I saw a flicker of disgust in her eyes. The court will take a brief recess to review all evidence presented today. We'll reconvene in 30 minutes for final arguments and ruling. As people began filing out of the courtroom, I stayed in my seat, overwhelmed by everything that had happened. Margaret squeezed my shoulder. We've got this, she said quietly. His own words convicted him. There's no coming back from that. But as I watched David leave with his family, surrounded by their protective circle of denial and money, I realized this victory might be hollow. Even if the judge ruled in our favor, even if Tommy was legally recognized as David's son, The damage was already done. David had chosen his side and it wasn't ours. 30 minutes felt like 3 hours. I spent the recess in the hallway outside the courtroom, pacing back and forth while Margaret made phone calls and reviewed her notes. Through the tall windows, I could see David's family huddled together in the parking lot. Richard was gesturing animatedly, while Patricia dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. David stood apart from them, hands in his pockets, staring at the ground. A few other people had gathered for the afternoon session, mostly court personnel and a couple of other lawyers waiting for their cases. I felt exposed, like everyone knew exactly why I was there and what was at stake. A young mother with a toddler smiled at me sympathetically from across the hall, and I wondered if she could somehow sense what I was going through. When the bailiff called us back into the courtroom, my legs felt wobbly. This was it. After months of legal battles, after years of David's family treating me like an outsider, after watching my son's father publicly deny his existence, we were finally going to get an answer. Judge Morrison entered with a folder in her hand, her expression serious but not unkind. She settled into her chair and spent a long moment reviewing the papers in front of her. The silence stretched until I thought I might scream from the tension. "This court has reviewed all evidence presented today," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "Medical records, birth certificates, witness statements, photographic evidence, and most significantly, documented communications between the parties." She looked directly at David, who was staring at his hands. "Mr. Hartwell, your text messages to the plaintiff during her pregnancy represent clear, consistent, and voluntary acknowledgement of paternity. These weren't statements made under duress or legal pressure. They were private communications expressing genuine parental feelings and expectations." My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. Margaret reached over and took my hand, her fingers steady and warm. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "the timeline evidence presented by the defense fails to create reasonable doubt about paternity. The plaintiff's medical records clearly establish conception dates that align with the defendant's presence and documented relationship with the plaintiff." David's lawyer was taking notes frantically, probably already thinking about appeals and next steps. But I could see the writing on the wall in Judge Morrison's tone and demeanor. Most importantly, this court recognizes that the defendant has acted as this child's father for 3 years. He signed the birth certificate, participated in medical appointments, maintained a parental relationship, and repeatedly acknowledged the child as his own. These actions constitute legal recognition of paternity regardless of current denials. The judge paused, looking around the courtroom. "It is the ruling of this court that Thomas David Hartwell is the biological and legal son of David Michael Hartwell. The defendant is hereby ordered to provide child support in accordance with state guidelines, and the plaintiff is awarded sole legal and physical custody with visitation rights to be determined in family court." The words hit me like a wave of relief so powerful I almost fell out of my chair. Tommy was legally David's son. Forever. No matter what happened next, no matter what David's family said or did, there was now a court document that proved my son's identity. I started crying before I could stop myself. Not the angry, frustrated tears I'd been fighting all day, but tears of pure relief. Margaret hugged me tightly, whispering congratulations in my ear. Behind us, I could hear Patricia Hartwell crying again, but I couldn't tell if it was from grief or relief. As the courtroom began to empty, I turned to look at David one last time. He was standing next to his lawyer, his face pale and empty. For just a moment, our eyes met across the room. I saw something there, maybe regret, maybe sadness, but it was gone before I could be sure. His father brushed past me on his way out, his face twisted with anger. "This isn't over," he muttered, just loud enough for me to hear. But it was over. The legal battle, at least, was finished. Margaret and I gathered our papers slowly, letting the courtroom clear out around us. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Empty," I admitted. "I thought I'd feel victorious, but mostly I just feel sad. For Tommy, for David, for all of us." She nodded understandingly. "Winning a custody case doesn't fix a broken family, but your son will grow up knowing that you fought for him, that you never let anyone make him feel like he didn't belong." We walked out of the courthouse together into the late afternoon sunshine. My phone had 3 missed calls from my mother, probably desperate to know how things had gone. Tommy would be getting hungry soon. wondering where Mommy was, ready to play and laugh and be 3 years old. I looked back at the courthouse one last time. Inside that building, a judge had confirmed what I'd always known. Tommy was David's son, my son, a real person with real rights who deserved to be acknowledged and protected. The battle was over, but the healing would take much longer. As I drove toward my mother's house to pick up Tommy, I tried to imagine explaining all of this to him someday. How do you tell a child that his father chose to pretend he didn't exist? How do you help him understand that sometimes adults make terrible choices that have nothing to do with his worth or value? But those were problems for another day. Today, I'd won the fight that mattered most. Tommy would grow up with legal proof of who he was, and no one could ever take that away from him. It wasn't the family I'd dreamed of when I first got pregnant, but it was enough. It had to be enough.